Sixth day, Upwater month, 0 CE. It took a week of paddling up the Rolengork to reach the clan hold of Tak. Rana Saj stopped for a day each at Ulixit and Koro, the two cities along the river to their destination, to check for new developments with the local lords. Aside from that, their journey was uninterrupted, uneventful, and filled with casual conversation. Tak was a clanhold nestled in the rocky foothills where the ranges of the Yorgulan front met with those of the Wallspine. The settlement served as the northeasternmost terminus of the country's river transportation network, and the surrounding territory was home to the Kon, a race of Felid beastmen previously unknown to the Beastman Confederacy. They were a Tanford people who were slightly smaller than Bar, with the common individuals ranging from 2 to 2.5 meters tall. Despite living on the high fringes of the jungle valley, there was little sense that the clanhold was remote or backwards compared to the rest of the country. It used the same, simple architecture and pragmatic logic for urban development as all of the other settlements in the river basin they had passed through thus far. Tax markets and limited industry were positioned along the riverfront, while residential areas were higher on the forested slopes. From here, it's a day's march to the Gorlia, Rana Saj told them. The fortress has a settlement that services the forces stationed in the pass, but, if you have any special needs, you may want to make sure they are addressed before departing Tak. How high is this fortress? Soraka asked. What sort of weather should we expect? It can be chilly in the winter, the Rana answered. The local Kon tribes occupy the territory up to around 100 kilometers north of the fortress. A good amount of snow comes down for a few months of the year at the higher altitudes, but the pass itself rarely remains snowbound. So you have something like a permanent problem in the north, Soraka said. Tribes suited to frozen alpine climbs won't have any trouble defending against further advances. The turning of the seasons will see territorial holdings shift back and forth. As with many parts of the world, environmental changes, be they seasonal or daily shifts in temperature, the cycle of rains, or other phenomena, produced patterns of raiding and migration in turn. For instance, seasonal rains and flooding turned otherwise difficult areas for aquatic and semi-aquatic races into prime feeding grounds. This was, by Rana Saj's account, what was happening on the Yorgulan front. On Rolengork's northern frontier, races with advantages in high mountain environments came and went with the coming and going of winter. By the same token, it was practically impossible to oust them from territories that were frozen year-round. Unfathomably complex systems arose from the interactions that occurred between shifting biomes. Seemingly insignificant local events could influence the fate of beings throughout the region, which in turn might change the world. The story of Rolengork was a prime example of this. A jungle nation had arisen in a region blessed by a single, expansive river network. In less than 200 years, they expanded to the extent that their level of technology, magic and thinking allowed. Now they were learning the necessary steps to reach beyond the cradle of their civilization. This, of course, came with all sorts of challenges, especially when societies rose swiftly. In a word, the development of early civilizations was often imbalanced. Since calamities commonly befell entire regions of the world, this tended to be the case more often than not. The most resourceful and aggressive survivors of each calamity would find themselves in a situation where the highly valuable lands left behind by their destroyed predecessors were free for the taking. If they were lucky, or unlucky, depending on what it was, some portion of their predecessors' legacies would remain. In a favorable situation, the result was an explosive resurgence of the races of the civilization that had flourished there previously. Depending on what they retained or recovered, the cultures that arose could vary widely. Those that had lost everything would have to relearn the lessons that they had forgotten, and many of them never did before another calamity visited ruin upon them. Tell me, Rana Saj, Soraka asked, when did the tribes of Rolengork start banding together in common cause? It depends on which part of the Rolengork, Rana Saj answered. Generally speaking, the banding together of large clans started in the east. About a century ago, the furthest extent of our side's expansion was roughly 300 kilometers into the Yorgulan reach. Soraka turned away from his assessment of the surrounding foothills, giving Rana Saj a sidelong look. Really, now? He said, what happened? The Yorgulans banded together in common cause, Rana Saj replied wryly. Erolesa was about half conquered by a half-dozen independent beastman clans from this side before it turned around and joined the nascent alliance that is now called the Yorgulan Commonwealth. They pushed us straight back over the mountains. When that happened, our easternmost clans also formed an alliance to resist further incursion. Once the border situation stabilized, the newly allied eastern tribes turned their political will westward. So the current confederation is the product of diplomacy? It was more practicality than anything else, the Rana told him. The notion of collective security was attractive to the tribes of the north and the south. In the Central Valley, many small kingdoms had already formed, but they saw how the hand of fate was moving. It's strange how that happens. It took less than a generation to accomplish, but, before then, everyone was preoccupied with their own holdings and immediate neighbors until a greater force acted upon us from the outside. Was there no resistance at all to those advances? There was nothing that could be called a major conflict. Though there are thousands of tribes, we share more similarities than differences. Diplomacy and the recognition of economic advantages did most of the work. As a whole, the Confederation of Rolengork was primitive by the standards of the Beastman Confederacy. However, it still boasted a colossal economy. This economy was almost entirely what carnivorous beastmen would consider agrarian. Not only did this mean that its industries revolved around forestry and ranching, but it also meant that its population was also one of its principal products. According to Rana Saj, over 12 million beastmen dwelled in Rolengork. More importantly, its tribal civilization had evolved from its primal state by several steps, transforming into a society that shared many similarities with the Beastman Confederacy of antiquity. One of the most notable similarities was the formalization of a simple caste system, which was central to nearly every known major demi-human state. Rolengork's system was largely unrefined, but it was essential if they wanted to step out into the wider world. Even without it, there was something to be said for the sheer inertia that Rolengork possessed. The population growth and a resulting demand for territory were enough to constitute a major crisis for most countries if they found themselves on the receiving end of a migration. Several members of Soraka's house guard appeared with Devi, who had loaded them up with goods like peddlers. His first wife was not a combatant, so she usually found her own things to do during the more militant legs of their journey. Usually, this meant she would be investigating the local economy, which was Devi's way of saying that she was going off to have her own fun. So, Soraka asked, "What are you inflicting on the locals this time?" "I'm not inflicting anything," Devi gave him a look. "Merchants provide goods and services." "So, what goods and services are you inflicting on the locals this time?" The merchant's daughter rolled her eyes. "We're headed to a garrison, so what do you expect? Liquor, better quality provisions from the usual, medicinal salves and tinctures. That sort of thing. The way that warriors here distinguish themselves also means we can stock equipment once the achievements start rolling in. And I'm sure our warriors will appreciate your services," Rana Saj said. "Now that you're ready, we should make our way to the fortress while the light is still good." "You mentioned that it's a day away," Soraka said, "but how many kilometers is a day's march for your warriors?" 40 kilometers on flat, unobstructed terrain, the Rana replied. "The trail ascends 2,000 meters from here, but we should make it in good time." An army column only moved as quickly as its slowest members, so its marching speed was an indicator of the strength and composition of any force. What races were present also heavily factored into that calculation. As far as civilians went, most Felid beastmen could only cover about 20 kilometers in a day. Clan Kira was composed entirely of Bar, so it suggested that the warrior clan was decently strong. "Should we expect attacks along the way?" Soraka asked. Decades of tribal warbands marching along the trail turned it into more of a wide road. Its orange clay, which was characteristic of jungle environments the world around, was parched and cracked. A thin cloud of dust rose behind them, carried off by the unceasing mountain winds. Soraka eyed the valley below and the slopes above, idly identifying potential ambush locations. "We're coming to the start of the dry season," Raj Sana answered, "so any remaining tribal holdouts would be hidden deep in the valleys." "They don't retreat with the end of the summer monsoon?" "Oh, they try. We've been at this for generations now, so hurting the Yorgulans as much as possible has become a regular part of our overall strategy. When the rains come, the Yorgulans push hard. We don't contest them much, we focus on preserving our forces while withdrawing deep into our side of the mountains." "I see. So you trap as many here as possible before the season turns." Rana Saj bore his fangs in a savage grin.
Exactly.
We take the high passes, avoiding the valleys to come behind them and cut off their retreat.
Then nature takes its course.
The trapped Yorgulans can only withdraw further into our territory as the mountain valleys dry up. We get rid of them at our leisure at the beginning of winter before pushing over the pass.
Surely they've caught on to this.
The Yorgulan forces do not have a unified command structure,
Rana Saj said.
Each power in the Commonwealth contributes its own forces, but they each only answer to themselves. Even within those forces, there is a high degree of independence.
How does that differ from Roland Gork?
Not that much, to be honest, Rana Saj chuckled. A clan like Kira is a match for a country on the other side, should we muster our full might. I suppose the main difference is that Roland Gork's clans all follow the same overarching defensive strategy. The warrior clans rotate responsibilities, allowing us to maintain the same strength on the border over the year. In other words, they were probably just as independent as their neighbors on the offense. A clan like Kira had hundreds of constituent tribes, with each tribal chieftain answering only to Rana Saj. Given the apparent nature of the conflict, each season probably saw tens of thousands of low-intensity engagements akin to raids or skirmishes. That being said, he wouldn't be surprised if hundreds of thousands of people were lost every year. Many small battles tended to add up. Is there anything that breaks the usual ebb and flow of the war?
Saraka asked.
For the first decade or so, Rana Saj answered, both sides try to match forces. That proved to be a colossal mistake on our part. Things became too predictable. They could loosely pinpoint our champions since we were using them to keep theirs in check.
The same could be said in reverse, Saraka noted.
True, the Rana replied, but our side doesn't have dragons. So by knowing where your strongest elements were, they also knew where they weren't. Rana Saj nodded grimly, a low growl rising from his throat. Dragons excel when the difference in individual power is great. A weak warband can't even scratch an adult green dragon, and that dragon can kill hundreds or even thousands in seconds. By defining where the risks to the dragons were, they also knew where they could strike with impunity. How often do they appear now? Rarely. Now that we've put together forces that can reliably kill adult greens, they won't show their cowardly faces. I'm curious, Rana Saj, Karawaki asked, have your forces developed any spells or skills or martial arts to fight your draconic adversaries with?
We have.
Dragons are ultimately what keep us from conquering the Commonwealth, so most of our free resources have been committed to dealing with them. Is what you've come up with only useful against green dragons, or are they effective against dragons in general? Proving that is difficult. The blue dragons of the Great Loot would obliterate our entire country if we challenged them. We sent some expeditions to slay the red dragons in the volcanic southwest, but none have returned. The draconic kingdom in the west is ironically dragonless. My father went and killed an adult brass dragon with a handful of our dragon slayers about a decade ago, and they claim that their methods worked. Saraka looked towards the snow-capped peaks peeking out between the peaks in the north. Are there any dragons in this part of the walled spine?
He asked. I don't doubt it, Rana Saj answered, but we haven't seen any.
Then again, the tribes of the walled spine are so belligerent that even dragons might not be able to survive there, or they could just be that reclusive. The Brightness Dragon Lord laired in the highest peak of the walled spine, far to the southeast. He never went out of his way to show anyone that he was around. Powerful dragons were involved in affairs that were beyond the understanding of mortals. They only meddled in mortal affairs if it suited their purposes. As Rana Saj promised, they arrived at Gorlia early with daylight to spare. The fortress was fashioned out of a butte overlooking the center of the 10-kilometer-wide valley at the end of the Yorgulan frontier's northernmost pass. Unlike most fortifications built in passes, it was clearly not designed to stop anyone from bypassing it. Instead, it was meant to withstand long sieges over the wet season, its garrison sallying forth when the jungles dried up to trap overly aggressive Yorgulan forces in Roland Gork. You're going to be here through the summer?
Saraka asked. No, Rana Saj answered. A warrior clan is only responsible for a single season. This time, our responsibility is to clean out the trapped Yorgulan forces while the previous clan bars them from crossing back over the pass. We'll be raiding the Yorgulans over the winter, but another clan will come to relieve us when the monsoon arrives. Is the fortress on the other side controlled by you or the Yorgulans? It changes ownership seasonally. During the dry season,
It's the main base for our offensives in northern Lesser. We abandon the position during the wet season. Trying to defend the fortress year-round isn't worth it.
Even so, Davy said, your logistics must be extensive to fight over these mountains year-round.
The Rana looked away.
Logistics, eh?
You can't be serious, Davy was aghast.
Well, it isn't as if we have no logistics to speak of. Rana Saj said, it's just that substantial logistics are impractical. Proper supply lines would be targeted by raids, both from the Orgulan tribes and their draconic masters. Guarding those supply lines ties up valuable warriors. The frontier can't be perpetually held by any tribe on either side, so our forces simply feed themselves through hunting the plentiful prey in this wilderness. It was the most basic form of warfare, hailing back from before the dawn of known civilization. Despite this, it was still effective, or perhaps it had gotten more effective as civilizations advanced. Tribal conflict rooted in survival, securing food, water and other essentials, became more lucrative as tribes advanced. Manufactured goods could be gained, as could knowledge and slaves. By waging war, one power could steal the productivity of another.
Is the equipment scheme of your warriors also the result of this?
Soraka asked. That's right, Rana Saj answered. We fight according to our natural advantages. Fresh warriors have very basic equipment and none of it is enchanted. The best use full panoplies of magical armor and other items. Soraka eyed the Rana's bodyguard. All of them were fully equipped, and most had several enchanted pieces. When he and his entourage had arrived at the Kiera docks, however, the vast majority of the embarking warriors wore little beyond vests of sturdy knock leather.
And do the Yorgulans do the same?
For the most part, the Rana replied.
The races of the Commonwealth vary widely in their traits, but nearly all of them possess a noxious nature.
Well, that part won't be a problem for your party, even for your merchant wife.
In that case, shouldn't poison resistance items be safe to use by your warriors?
It isn't as if we have natural weapons of that type.
Those are usually the first items that young warriors try to purchase, but the demand is high relative to the number of artisans. He pondered the matter-of-fact way in which the Kiera ruler conveyed himself. Clan Kiera's organization was good enough for Soraka to need to remind himself that they were still primitive in their systems of governance, economy and military service. The fact that they referred to their soldiers as warriors should have served as an indication that they were still very much using a system of tribal prestige. New warriors had to prove themselves on the field before earning the right to wear anything beyond basic equipment. Before reaching adulthood, their training amounted to playing and hunting in their home jungles. Do you have any children, Rana Saj? Soraka asked.
Fighting on this frontier, perhaps? 3, the Rana answered. And 3 more on the way. But only my eldest can be considered an adult. I believe he acquitted himself well during his first season on the Orgulan front. Oh? Do tell.
A hint of fatherly pride could be sensed in the Bar Lord's voice and posture.
He had a quiet start, but he distinguished himself in an Icani ambush about a month into the monsoon 2 years ago. Using a rock, if his claims are to be believed.
What are the Icani like, here?
There are many different sub-races.
They're bluish-green in the Orgulan Basin, Rana Saj told him.
Their shells have rows of tiny envenomed spines. The venom affects coordination and can build up to become paralytic. Though the ones that Soraka knew of didn't like being compared to them, the Icani were crayfish demi-humans. They had heavy shells as tough as steel plate armor and their large claws were employed to grapple and tear apart their prey or opponents. Slashing attacks, as Felid beastmen were wont to use, were predictably ineffective against them. Fortunately, Icani was slow in the water and even slower on land. According to Hol, the Rana continued, his raiding party strayed too close to a flooding creek. It's a common error for new warriors. They grow impatient and try to bring the fight to the enemy, giving away an advantageous position or entering a disadvantageous one. I suppose that's the same wherever one is, Soraka said. We are born to stalk and pounce. Those of your warrior caste should at least address instinctual problems when instructing youths, yes? I'm sure he knew, Rana Saj replied. He wasn't the leader of the raiding party, though. That fool was the first to go under. Hrolb not only survived, but he salvaged the situation by exploiting the Icani's overconfidence in their initial success. He took command of the broken group and lured those oversized crayfish far out of the water. Surely they shouldn't fall for that? Whether they should or shouldn't have doesn't change the fact that it happened. Perhaps they were young, as well. Once they strayed far enough, Roll turned around and started bashing away at them with a small boulder. I don't ever recall teaching him to do that, but if it works. As cumbersome as they were on land, being chased by a beastman intent on cracking them open with a rock was likely a terrifying thing to an Icani. Did he get all of them? Most of them. He claimed a dozen kills in that battle alone. The surviving members of the raiding party collectively managed 5 times that. His season was filled with fighting following that battle. Every patrol managed to run into the enemy and every raid was a success. Is the opponent's race determined by which kingdom or faction claims the same part of the front? No, Rana Saj shook his head. It's determined by the amount of rain. The Commonwealth forces are evenly distributed across the front, but which ones can advance depends on the terrain. The wetter it gets, the more races you see. Icani, for instance, only come when the rivers flood and act as heavy infantry. How do your tribes deal with such a versatile foe? What we'll encounter at each stage is more or less predictable. We don't fight to hold our ground, so it limits what they can throw at us. Right. Even the strategies used by Roland Gork spoke of their undeveloped martial traditions. Much like how wilderness tribes competed, the beastmen here applied steady pressure through raids and drawn-out conflict. This wasn't bad in itself, but Soraka wondered how their overall situation might improve if something more complex was employed. Is there any sign of the Yorgulan's overall situation growing worse over the years? It's difficult to say, Rana Saj said. When we inflict particularly devastating losses to certain races over the course of the year, we'll notice reduced numbers. Even so, it doesn't buy us much of a reprieve. But what about their other borders? Shouldn't significant losses on this front weaken them as a whole? Our information on the Commonwealth's other affairs is gained second-hand through merchants in the Great Loot. The desert spans across the southern border of 3 different powers, Roland Gork, the Commonwealth, and another group of countries that call themselves the League of Morgolla. What is Stormport's relationship to the Yorgulans and Morgolla? He asked. The same as ours, apparently, Rana Saj answered. Stormport trades with all 3 of its northern neighbors. Soraka pondered the Rana's information. It was, quite frankly, dangerous to rely on the Stormport's merchants for information. The Desert Empire had a vested interest in keeping its northern neighbors at each other's throats. At the same time, a collection of states dominated by green dragons couldn't be trusted to do anything but obey the whims of its cunning and subversive masters. If the people there couldn't overthrow their overlords, then they had to be overthrown before they grew to a problematic age. In that case, Soraka said, how good is the Commonwealth's relationship with its other neighbors? Not good at all, Rana Saj replied. Presumably, they war with the Wallspine's denizens just as much as we do. The same applies to the tribes along their southern border. Morgolla is also at war with the Commonwealth. The Yorgulans will also attack travelers and merchants from the Great Loot if they go beyond the trading posts on their border. Is there some reason why they're so universally belligerent? That should be self-explanatory, Rana Saj said. No one can trust their masters and their masters trust no one. War is the only way. Except that it's not. The problem appeared to be threefold. First, primal competition set a premise for aggression. Secondly, the reputation of green dragons was just that terrible. Thirdly, Stormport appeared to be feeding any and all interested parties a narrative crafted to support their monopoly on each country's trade. Several solutions existed in other regions in similar situations. The natural solution where a combination of environment, resources and local powers achieved equilibrium, could only happen to the north and the south. Along most of its length, the southern side of the walled spine was fed by monsoons that swept in from the Cerulean Way. According to the Druids in their entourage, the Great Loot generated a colossal vortex that dictated the patterns of weather across the northwestern part of the continent. The weather resulting from the vortex and the rivers flowing down from the mountains resulted in a thick band of vegetation south of the walled spine. Civilizations that arose within that band had the unfortunate, or fortunate, depending on whether one was strong or weak, tendency to expand along it until advancements in technology and magic allowed them to settle in other environments. The latter part wasn't an option for Roland Gork yet, but there were still others. I understand that your diplomatic options in the East are practically non-existent, Soraka said, but what about the West?
Rana Saj glanced at him out of the corner of his eye.
You mean with the Draconic Kingdom? He said. Unless I'm mistaken, they're the only formal state to your west. From what I've heard so far, Rolengork's aggression has been one-sided. Predators conducting diplomacy with prey, I don't think that's possible. Especially not now. We've been eating them for as long as history can tell. But your merchants conduct trade with Stormport without issues, Soraka noted. Merchants are merchants, the Rana looked forward again. The general population does not hold the same expectations for foreign lands. Besides, it's better for us to conquer them now that we've discovered that they are no threat to us. There were certain merits in his statement. For one, sovereign states always had a degree of resistance to foreign influence. One could not dictate policy to them unless an insurmountable advantage in power existed. Furthermore, that advantage usually had to be demonstrated at least once. Even after a clear hierarchy was established, inefficiencies still existed due to the extra layers of communication and bureaucracy. Another problem was that feral humans were behaviorally problematic. Their societies were insular and intolerant. Humans with power tended to get drunk on that power, and a human nation was a collective extension of that tendency. As such, the universal approach to feral human states was to destroy them. Cultural reform or integration would follow. Once that was out of the way, humans were perfectly capable of thriving wherever they found themselves. Whether they were slaves, citizens or something else depended on the civilization they were attached to, but humans had certain advantages that demi-humans did not. Those advantages made them especially valuable to society as professionals in a wide variety of fields. Well, it's not like I'm here to force our culture onto theirs, and it isn't as if I could. His mission was to investigate the country and make inroads if they proved to be suited for inclusion into the Confederacy's sphere of influence. To the Confederacy Council, gaining such an ally was much faster than colonizing new lands. Adoption of Confederacy culture was a long process that couldn't be rushed, and it was still yet to be seen if they qualified as allies at all. 7th day, Upper Water Month, 0 CE. So, how do we split things up? I'm staying behind the lines, Davy said. You won't catch me romping around a battlefield. The merchant had, in fact, romped around a battlefield before. She didn't fight personally, instead focusing on somehow making a profit. Even so, Soraka supposed that it wasn't really her thing. I meant the rest of us, he said. Rana Saj needed to situate the tribal warbands that had accompanied him to the Gallia, so he bid Soraka and his entourage to wait in their accommodations. They were guided to a small barracks with simple furnishings, which most of them didn't mind. Davy and Karabaki looked a bit displeased as they were accustomed to having more privacy. Would you like to stay with me, Mitra? Davy asked. We could sell up a storm between us. I'm going with them, Mitra answered. This is a rare chance to let loose, after all. Davy's striped tail drooped and her sigh drifted into the air. In the end, the merchant remained with 4 of Soraka's house guard. They would go back and forth peddling their wares throughout the season. The rest of the entourage would remain with Soraka, acting as his warband on the Orgulan frontier. After waiting in their room for an hour with no word from Rana Saj, Soraka went to take a look around the fortress. The guards stationed on the cliffside walkway outside straightened at his appearance. He approached them with an unassuming air while gazing out at the landscape of the valley. Rana Saj said he'd send someone for us. Ah, about that, one of the guards replied. A runner arrived from the north. He looked over the edge of the walkway. Due to the structure of the fortress, it didn't have a courtyard, but the clearing at its base served as a mustering field. Most of Clan Kiera's forces remained below, as they would be deployed over the pass once Rana Saj was updated on the theater's situation. Our lord is in the war room atop the plateau, the guard said. I can guide you there if you wish. Please, thank you. As Gallia was built on a butte, its limited space meant that most of its rooms were carved out along the upper third of its 300-meter height. The fortress could sustain an army of 30,000 for several years, though the regular sieges experienced by its defenders were more or less half the duration. Gallia's design was especially problematic for Rolengork's semi-aquatic adversaries. The fortress was exposed to the elements and remained dry throughout the season. It was impossible to scale and occupy for many races that might find themselves at home in a flooded rainforest. The citadel atop the fortress took up every square meter of space.
Additionally, it had many long hoardings jutting out over the edge of the butte, which allowed its defenders to attack the single spiraling approach from above with impunity.
I like the way this place is set up, Soraka said, but how do you deal with flying opponents?
Aside from dragons,
the guard said, the Yorgulans have no flying combatants.
Gallia was purposely designed to withstand green dragon attacks.
The guard gestured to the stone walkway.
All of the surfaces here are purposely angled to prevent a green dragon's breath attacks from pooling. We learned that lesson the hard way early on when our holds here were more conventional. He could imagine the excruciating fate of those who had to find out the hard way. The breath attack of a green dragon was heavier than air, allowing it to flow into structures and fill the rooms and hallways. It was a poisonous gas that would pool underground and eat away at food stores and equipment with its corrosive potency. Needless to say, those caught in the attack would find their lungs melted and hides burning away. Several unfamiliar faces were present with Ranasaj in the war room. At the head of its long stone table was one of the lords of the Osalo race unique to the west. Opposite Ranasaj was a member of the Khan.
Soraka, Ranasaj greeted him. You have my apologies for the delay.
It's not a problem, Soraka replied.
We're simply guests who have imposed ourselves here, after all.
An honored guest nonetheless, the Rana replied, then gestured to the others at the table. May I introduce you to Rana Ori of the Osalo? He's served as the commanding officer of Gallia over the past season.
The Osalo lord bobbed his head in greeting.
We don't get visitors here often, he said. You have the bearing of a mighty lord, however, so perhaps you might be interested in testing the mettle of some of the locals. Among other things, Soraka grinned. Our journey has been mostly peaceful and some of my warriors would appreciate a good fight.
Rana Ori thumped a paw on the table.
Excellent, he nodded.
We have a major raid coming down from the walled spine.
Winter is on its way and with it come the savage northern tribes. Are you familiar with any of them?
I have experienced the walled spine, but not this part of it.
But I guess it's equally hostile wherever you go.
Is that so?
Well, I guess we shouldn't feel so singled out then. According to the runner here, the raid started over a week ago. The Yeti tribes living in the ice fields to the northwest all came down from their homes at the same time. I assume that's not normal here?
Not at all.
Their raids are usually from single tribes against single tribes.
I see.
How would you usually respond in this situation? Soraka came forward and joined them at the table, standing beside Ranasaj. Rolled out between the warriors was a map inked out on a roll of vellum.
We'll have to delay the relief of my forces, Rana Ori said.
The Osalo are not suited for winter fighting, so Clan Kira needs to divert while Clan Ori holds its positions. I'll warn my warbands of the additional delay. The passing of duties in a theater from one force to another was always a vulnerable point in any defensive scheme. Given that the Yorgulan forces should be retreating with the dry season, however, it probably wasn't too difficult or risky of an adjustment to make. I believe that half of my tribes can continue deploying over the pass, Ranasaj said. The good runner here delivered an estimate of 5,000 Yeti warriors. 15,000 bar will be enough to contain them and help shore up the northern defenses against other wilderness tribes that might cause mischief while we deal with the Yeti.
That sounds reasonable, Rana Ori nodded.
I appreciate your consideration. It's been a long season and our warriors would like to see their families again. When do we march north?
Soraka asked.
Tomorrow morning, Ranasaj answered. I assume you have something for the cold?
We do.
Our travels necessitate endure elements items. A bit of cold won't be a problem. They departed before dawn, making their way northeast around the mountains to the north of the fortress. As they gained altitude, the vegetation transitioned from a dense tropical jungle to a primal conifer rainforest. Over the next 2 days, as their provisions dwindled, a thought occurred to Soraka. We're in someone's territory, right? We'll be hunting their game at this rate. It's not a problem, Ranasaj replied. We can hunt as we need to in this situation, but the holds along the way should do most of the provisioning out of their stores. The best part about the walled spine is that it's easy to preserve meat. The Khan will be scrambling to clear their frozen stores to make room.
Make room?
Soraka narrowed his eyes. Yeti are delicious, you know. The Rana told him, that layer of fat they all have is exquisite. A single adult Yeti can sustain one of us for 5 or 6 months as long as their flesh can be preserved.
You make these raids almost sound a welcome thing. The fact that they asked for help says something in itself. Usually, the Khan keep their frozen treats to themselves. Low laughter rose from the nearby warriors. The prospects of the coming battle only seemed to lift their spirits. A guide from the front lines awaited them at a camp near the tree line. Even as high as they already were, the icy peaks of the walled spine stood in stark relief to the surroundings. The mere sight was intimidating, and Soraka's senses picked up countless indications of unseen danger. "Thank you for coming," the guide said. Rana Puir's been coordinating a fighting retreat since the last blizzard. The front is another 1,000 meters above, 10 kilometers northwest of here. Did Rana Puir leave any instructions or information for us? No, the guide shook her head. The front is changing too quickly. I was instructed to bring you to him. Your warriors can rest here for now. The guide led them out of the camp. A landscape of shrubs, lichen-covered boulders and patches of snow replaced the forest above the tree line. Tongues of long glaciers flowed out from the ice cap above. Frigid winds, tinged with the scent of bloodshed, lashed their way down the slope. As they approached a large patch of bush sheltered by the boulders of an old moraine, a head popped out to look in their direction. They entered the vegetation, finding the interior spacious enough to shelter dozens of beastmen. Several Khan lords looked towards the entrance at their approach. A particularly large one came forward to greet them. Rana Saj. That was unexpectedly slow. Rana Dratha's offensive in the Draconic Kingdom has added delays to everything, Rana Saj replied. Not that our enemies mind. How are things here, Rana Puir? There are more of the Yeti than usual, but their offensive patterns are still the same. How long until their shamans recover? Nightfall. How many warriors did you bring? 15,000. Are the other wilderness tribes up to anything? Not that we've seen, Rana Puir replied. At least not on our side. They may be waiting for the Yeti to be weakened before attacking them instead of us. If only life were that convenient. Winter is their opportunity to strike at our territories. Soraka glanced at Rana Saj out of the corner of his eye. It was a dangerous assumption to make. Many a novice commander relied entirely on logic, believing warfare to be rational and follow established behaviors, only to have the enemy commander purposely do something irrational to bring about their end. Or worse, a commander might have their own forces do something unexpected to the same result. Additionally, information was rarely perfect and timely, resulting in each side having a different perspective of an unfolding conflict. I'm not familiar with this lord, or lords? Ah, Rana Saj turned and gestured to Soraka. Forgive me for the late introduction. This is Soraka, a visitor from the world beyond. The lady here is Mitra, one of Soraka's wives. Welcome to Rolengork, Rana Puir bobbed his head in greeting. Visitors to our country are usually the hostile sort, so I hope you don't mind our rough welcome. We are pleased to be here, Rana Puir, Soraka returned his greeting. We're all warriors, so seeing how your people conduct themselves in battle is of great interest to us. In that case, I hope we don't embarrass ourselves, Rana Puir chuckled. The Yeti are brutes, so we must answer in kind. It's far from elegant. The Khan Lord brought them to the center of the thicket. A map of the nearby mountains was rolled out on a slab of granite. Our patrols detected Yeti scouts about 2 weeks before the offensive came, Rana Puir told them, but we had no idea of its magnitude. There weren't any more scouts than in the years before, so we assumed that it would be more of the same. Fortunately, they're not very stealthy, so we saw them coming before they made it halfway down the nearest glacier. Do you know what's driving this raid? Rana Saj asked. We've made out at least 10 different tribes so far. 10? Rana Saj gave the Khan Lord a sharp look. The estimate delivered to Gaulia was half that. The estimate is a week old. Half the current number was enough to convince us to request assistance. It appeared that tribe was used as a unit for estimating army strength, one tribe representing 1,000 warriors. Still, it didn't indicate how strong the local Yeti tribes were. On the western side of the wall spine, the average Yeti was more powerful than the average Felid Beastman warrior. More accurately, the Yeti tribes still existed in a primal state, meaning that every member of a tribe could and did act as a warrior. This meant that a Yeti warrior was noticeably stronger than a Felid Beastman warrior in a physical sense, but they lacked the martial training of a Confederacy warrior. If there are at least 10 tribes, Rana Saj said,
We're dealing with a Yeti Lord strong enough to be considered the equivalent of your clan lords. Have your warriors seen anyone that matches the description?
Not yet, Rana Plia replied.
Yeti aren't exactly shrewd opponents, so it probably means there are even more coming.
Between us, we have 23,000 warriors. This might turn messy.
What percentage of the enemy must be put out of commission to force a withdrawal?
Soraka asked.
Going by past raids,
Rana Plia said, 1/3.
We've killed about 2,000 so far.
And how many have you lost? The same number.
Soraka looked down grimly at the map.
All else being equal, trading one Felid Beastman warrior for one Yeti warrior was a good deal. However,
the Yeti were not the only enemies of Roland Gork. Rana Plia's clan needed to preserve their strength to defend against raids from other wilderness tribes over the winter while Rana Saj's forces were supposed to be fighting on the Orgulan frontier. Sustaining significant losses against the Yeti would cascade into difficulties elsewhere.
How do the local Yeti tribes fight? Soraka asked.
Like many alpine races, Rana Plia replied,
they use the elements to their advantage. Fighting them in blizzards is impossible for us. When the weather is unfavorable to them, their shamans summon fog banks for their forces to advance in. Like many races that live in high mountain conditions, Yeti can see through fog, snow and other weather.
So, tonight, we'll have a fog filled with Yeti rolling down the mountainside.
That's what we expect. We still have a half dozen or so kilometers to maneuver, so skirmishes will be opportunistic.
Is there anything else we should know about? Rana Saj asked.
No, Rana Plia answered.
Aside from the scale, it's been surprisingly normal.
Rana Saj left the thicket, heading back down to the camp where his forces awaited.
Soraka and his entourage followed, examining the surroundings more thoroughly.
From a distance, it might appear as a bare slope due to the lack of trees, but there was plenty of cover to be had if one lay low.
They lost many warriors,
Soraka noted.
They did, Rana Saj agreed. It was probably the size of the raid that initially caught them off guard.
The runner that came to Gaulia was unsettled, but the tribes here seemed to be calm.
What are your expectations for this conflict, and how will they affect your work on the frontier?
That would depend on how much more is coming.
At the least, my warbands have to stay here to help counter the main thrust of the Yeti offensive. As for our duties on the frontier, the Orgulans are still limited by the changing seasons, so, at the worst, we'll withdraw early and keep things light. Upon returning to the camp, Rana Saj divided his forces into their respective tribal groupings and deployed them across the front. A general overview was provided, but no specific instructions were issued. They were to collaborate with the local defenders who better understood how the battles on the mountain took shape. Soraka and his entourage elected to stay with Rana Saj, who returned to the Rana Plia's thicket. It wasn't long after their arrival that scouts started reporting activity above. Another 5 Yeti tribes were added to the running estimate, negating the defenders' strength advantage entirely. How far up into the mountains have your forces been? Soraka asked the conlord as they watched a fog begin to form up the slope.
We've only been up to the toe of the glacier, Rana Plia answered. It's pointless for us to go further. Our raids go along the valleys below the mountain, but they can't get very far before the resident tribes make any incursion untenable.
Why do you ask?
I'm trying to develop a better picture of these tribes' war potential, Soraka said. Right now, it only seems as if there's an endless number of them coming down from the ice fields. But there must be a limit, and that limit is determined by available territory.
In that case, based on the number we kill every year and how quickly they replenish their numbers, the total population associated with the local Yeti tribes should be close to 60,000.
So they've sent nearly a quarter of their population to attack you.
Assuming the estimate is correct. It could be that there are many unassociated groups and there's been a migration of some sort up there that has changed the numbers from the norm. It's impossible for us to know.
Except that it wasn't. Soraka sent a glance at Mitra, who nodded slightly in response.
With the Yeti tribes on their way, they left the thicket to take their positions for the coming assault. The final traces of sunlight vanished from the tops of the icy peaks by the time the fog came within a kilometer of them. Soraka's nose wrinkled as the sour scent of Yeti started to permeate the air.
I forgot how much I hate that smell, he muttered.
Maybe I shouldn't have come. Mitra held a paw over more.
Warriors of the Roland Gork. Rana Plia's voice boomed over the mountainside. Our foes approach. Staunch allies have arrived to bolster our ranks, but this great raid is not to be taken lightly. Do not let our numbers fill you with overconfidence. We fight as we always have.
Well, that's interesting.
The conservative stance was to be expected, but the fact that Rana Puya cast his voice the way that he did was not. Commanders who drew attention to themselves made for attractive targets. Not to mention that the enemy could also hear what they were trying to do.
What are we doing, G?
Let's not distract them. We'll see how things go for now.
Soraka's entourage visibly relaxed, but they still closed around him and remained alert to their surroundings. His whiskers picking up heavy footfalls vibrating through the air was the first tangible sign of an imminent clash.
Think Rana Puya did that on purpose? Jirako asked from beside him, calling attention to himself. I mean,
Yeti aren't like them,
Soraka answered, so the Lord won't come running to issue a direct challenge. I suppose it's still useful if the general's bodyguard is much stronger than the rest. The Alpine demi-humans were elusive, but ultimately simple in their approach. Not many could withstand being so large, after all. By drawing attention to himself, Rana Puya relieved pressure on the warbands nearby. A chunk of ice shattered on a boulder nearby, sending shards spraying into the lurking beastmen. More crude projectiles came flying out of the fog, but the effect was minimal.
Should I heal them?
Let them do their thing. It's weird that they don't have any bards here. I don't think they have anything like the Sharon. Their caste system doesn't recognize bards as warriors. Though Rana Puya had announced his rough location, the beastmen still lay in ambush. The Yeti couldn't pinpoint any single target, only the vague location of where they had last heard Rana Puya. Soraka supposed that another reason why the Conlord had raised his voice was to make sure the Yeti were going in the right direction before concealing himself. The fog rolled over them. At the edge of his dark vision, a rotund silhouette appeared. Atop a 4-meter-tall form covered in long white fur were two pairs of horns shaped like an aurochs, their points facing forward. Between those horns was an ape-like face with a mouth lined with fangs. The Yeti thumped forward, its gleaming yellow eyes searching for enemies to fight. None of the beastmen obliged. They continued hiding where they were as more and more Yeti advanced. Soraka grinned. Their military tradition wasn't formalized and their tactical organization was rather haphazard, but it was clear that the warriors of Rolengork knew how to fight as a group. Rana Puya was the first to pounce. Unlike hobgoblins who would act in purposeful solidarity or minotaurs who took personal initiative to create displays of raw prowess, Rana Puya's attack was an independent move purposefully made to set off a chaotic chain of events. The ambush drew the attention of the nearest Yeti. When they turned, other beastmen pounced on them from behind. After inflicting grievous wounds, the beastmen didn't stick around to fight. Instead, they dashed down the slope. Their adversaries bellowed in rage and gave chase, only to be ambushed by other warriors hidden further along. Organized chaos expanded across the front, filling the air with bellows, roars and the stench of viscera. The fighting rapidly rippled toward them.
Are we running too?
We're right at the back. Dozens of beastmen sprinted by and kept going. It doesn't look like they're stopping. We'll run, too. More beastmen ran by. Soraka addressed his warband. Let's pretend to be unaccustomed to this tactic. Remain hidden until my signal. Bloodied Yeti howled as they stomped by, completely focused on their fleeing assailants. After the last of the beastmen passed, Soraka waited an additional minute. Kill everything in the way as we catch up. Go. Soraka and his entourage exploded out of the bushes. He bowled over his target and gave it an experimental swat. It died. The Yeti was about the same as those on the opposite end of the wall spine. Another came up behind him, its stained yellow claws brandished. A swift kick disemboweled it, sending the 1-ton demi-human spinning away with its innards trailing behind. Around him, the members of his house guard were having no discernible difficulties. Several had 4 or 5 Yeti tribespeople dead around them. A dismembered arm arced over his head. That should be good enough. Let's get out of here. He loped down the slope, casually ending any Yeti that blocked his path. Karavaki fell into step beside him. I don't see what's so fun about this, she said. We obliterated those hapless people. Well, there's usually not much hope for a challenge anywhere we go, Soraka said. It's still a part of our job. Just think of it as helping Rolengork. A temporary reprieve, at best. Helping people out of their problems requires what causes those problems to be remedied. And they seem to understand that, Soraka replied. Since they're on their way to solving their problems on their own, it won't hurt to do this much. The Ashtapradhan isn't as positive as you are on foreign matters, G. For all of the light that you see in others, they tend to focus on the shadows. It would be irresponsible of them to not consider all angles, Soraka said. With us always being on foreign assignments, we aren't up to date on what's going on at home. The balance of power is a delicate thing. With 6 superpowers around the center of the continent, nothing could be simple. Everything affected everything else. The Confederacy couldn't recklessly expand their hegemony. They needed to be mindful of who they focused their resources on, what conflicts they involved themselves in, and the effects their actions had on the world at large. At the same time, they couldn't remain idle and not forge new relationships at all. It would be foolish to believe that their rivals weren't doing the same thing that they were. Stagnation was the path to ruin. 5 kilometers downhill, they arrived at the Rana-Pul's reconsolidated lines. The Yetis who managed to chase them that far were put down forcefully, forming a row of corpses that stretched out along the front. Mystics tended to wounds as they prepared for the next assault. Rana Saj breathed out a sigh of relief as Soraka and his entourage came into view. You look pretty much unscathed, the Rana looked over at them. I was worried when you didn't appear on our tails. Your forces are well practiced, Soraka replied. It was impressive to witness. Especially when so many different tribes were involved. We couldn't quite move in step with you this first time. The latter part aside, what he said was genuine. While the warrior tribes were full-time combatants, they weren't professional soldiers. They were also from many different clans and of 2 different races. A not insubstantial amount of practical combat experience facilitated their smooth maneuver. You honor us with your praise, Rana Saj bobbed his head. By the way, I don't see your other wife. As if on cue, Mitra appeared out of the darkness. She waved a claw. No, the claw of the Yeti arm she was waving waved. The beautiful white tigress licked the fresh blood off of her maw. You were right, Rana Saj, she said. They're delicious.